The Diplomat, 28th of March 2024, 3 crucial ideas to know about China's hegemonic foreign policy. Some of my international acquaintances in Beijing tell me they are becoming increasingly perplexed about China's foreign policy. Is China seeking to alter the current Asia-Pacific geopolitical landscape? Is China using Europe as a weapon in negotiations with the US? What is the history of wolf warrior diplomacy? Their inquiries are intriguing and relevant to everyone. However, because some Chinese academics are reluctant to speak with international media, it might be challenging to get introductions from them. As a relatively independent journalist, I must provide a quick overview of my observations regarding China's foreign policy during the last 10 years. Although my opinion is undoubtedly not entirely accurate, I do not speak for the Chinese government. I think it will assist international analysts in better comprehending China's diplomacy. Diplomacy in the Global South. China has a diplomatic legacy of maintaining cordial ties with minor nations, developing nations, and the so-called Global South. For example, the Chinese foreign minister is required to make his first trip to Africa each year. Why? In addition to highlighting China's status as a developing nation, it also serves as a platform for China's ongoing diplomatic preparations. China's Global South diplomacy also includes fortifying ties with the Muslim world and Africa. China has been careful for decades to avoid opposing the views of Muslim countries collectively in multilateral forums. This mindset is nowhere more apparent than in the ongoing conflict in Gaza. China will not denounce Hamas in the UN or other international gatherings since Muslim nations have not done so. China will adjust its policies to any adjustments made by the Muslim world. Africa and Muslim nations comprise the 2 largest voting blocs in the UN, with over 50 votes from Africa and over 40 from the Muslim world, representing nearly half of the organization's membership. China needs their assistance on several problems to protect its interests properly. China's links with African and Muslim nations will be beneficial anytime Western nations bring up topics like Taiwan, the South China Sea, Xinjiang, human rights, and so on for consideration in the UN. The success of this diplomatic tradition may be seen in the fact that no Muslim nation in the world now backs the Western position on Xinjiang. The Houthi rebels, who are based in Yemen, have said that they will not attack Chinese warships for identical reasons. China's foreign policy thus emphasizes Global South diplomacy, which explains why China consistently shows tiny countries great courtesy. China is not solely driven by economic considerations regarding its foreign policy in Africa or its outreach to Muslim nations. China has a long-term strategy. United States and China's great power diplomacy. Foreign policy originates domestically and encompasses both political and economic aspects. Awareness of China's diplomacy requires understanding how foreign policy should create a stable external environment for economic development. China has maintained steady economic progress since the late 1970s, primarily due to the reforms and opening strategy implemented in the country. This approach does not open the door to the Global South but to the West. Although China has opened up to Asia, Africa, and Latin America since its creation in 1949, the country has not reaped enough economic benefits to spur progress, and most of its citizens continue to live in extreme poverty. In an incredibly short period, China's whole economy has changed since it opened up to the West, adopted a market economy, and attracted foreign investment. As a result, China prioritizes maintaining an open economic environment and the growth of its relations with Western countries, including the US, Europe, and Japan, as this is essential to ensuring sustainable development. China, for instance, is attempting to negotiate an STA, Science and Technology Agreement, with the United States and a Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, CAI, with Europe. I wholeheartedly support this great powers diplomacy type, which can directly affect China's economy. China will try to maintain stable economic relations with the West, notwithstanding the political issues between the 2 countries. China and Russia, on the other hand, have more political ties based on mutual support. There is energy and economic cooperation, but China primarily pursues this to prepare for the future. China and Western nations' diplomatic and economic ties will drastically alter in the event of a war in the Taiwan Strait, and China is unlikely to be able to handle the fallout on its own. China can rely on Russia's energy and agricultural supplies as a solid support system. Many Western observers suggest that Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia are establishing a new axis. China, I constantly say, is not like the other nations, which are anti-Western. It is an essential component of North Korea's, Iran's, and Russia's survival policies. That is not the case in China. It must maintain an open policy with Western nations to secure social growth and the welfare of 1.4 billion people. China's leadership conducts its diplomacy with the US, Japan, and EU based on the needs of the ordinary people, not on political expediency. The Chinese people will never accept a foreign policy that sours relations with the West, and China will never become North Korea. No matter how much of an anti-American they appear to be, a Chinese person would never choose to live in North Korea. Modern-day diplomacy. Currently, China's unilateral actions in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait are the primary source of concern for several Western nations. There is no agreement, and both sides believe they are correct, which makes this a serious issue. The Chinese leadership considers it a breach of the international order headed by the United Nations that certain Western nations have surrounded China by meddling in local, territorial conflicts. Beijing views China's territorial claims as an attempt to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity rather than annexing any other country's territory. The West, however, also feels that China's position modifies the status quo and transgresses the UN-led international order. They contend that China is attempting to annex land that is not theirs. In that context, the Western nations' presence in the area is motivated by preserving global peace and order. In light of this, the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy appeared globally. Although I wouldn't say I like this look, I can see why. It results from China's intense pressure on its diplomacy from the West. Consider it from a personal metaphor: someone who frequently loses their temper must be experiencing anxiety and nervousness inside. China is concerned for the following reasons: it has territorial or maritime disputes with at least 7 of its neighbors, and the West is getting increasingly involved in all of them, invariably siding with China's adversary. This has undoubtedly increased China's sense of unease with the outside world. China is taking 2 precautions against the risk: preparing for a military conflict and trying to progress in diplomacy. The latter is reflected in wolf warrior diplomacy, also known as New Style diplomacy, about vying with the West for the right to speak globally. China's increased supply of international public goods to the world community is another component of this plan that hasn't gotten as much attention. Beijing hopes that by doing this, more nations will recognize China's good intentions and reject the notion of a China threat. China's New Style diplomacy includes initiatives such as the 2013 Proposal for the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. China is trying to serve the global public interest like Japan's Official Development Assistance, ODA. Furthermore, China is engaged in Middle East diplomacy, undertaking initiatives like mediating the dispute between Saudi Arabia and Iran and preparing for a Middle East peace summit. China has also proposed a community with a shared future for mankind in recent years. These ideas adhere to the global framework established by the UN Charter. It makes sense that the West would find China's New Style diplomacy unsettling, given that its principal objective is to refute Western misconceptions about China. In the meantime, China's military buildup increases their hatred and tension. Although I'm unsure how to resolve the territorial issues or ease tensions, diplomatic interaction is always necessary for a thorough understanding.